Picture this. It's 1943, and you're a young German soldier who's just been captured in North Africa. You're terrified. You've been told horrific stories about what happens to prisoners of war, especially at the hands of the Americans. You're loaded onto a ship, crammed with other prisoners, all of you wondering if you'll even survive the journey. The Atlantic crossing takes weeks, and every day you expect the worst. But then something absolutely bizarre happens. You arrive in America, and instead of the hell you imagined, you find yourself in what can only be described as the strangest twist of fate in military history. Welcome to the untold story of German prisoners of war in the United States during World War II. A tale so unexpected, so paradoxical, that it would reshape how these men viewed America forever. Let me take you back to the moment when this whole incredible chapter began. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, nobody really thought about what would happen with enemy prisoners. The War Department had maybe a few thousand beds ready for POWs, tops. They figured, maybe we'll capture a few guys here and there. But then North Africa happened. Operation Torch kicked off in November 1942, and suddenly American and British forces were sweeping through Tunisia and Libya, and German and Italian soldiers were surrendering by the tens of thousands. We're talking about a tidal wave of prisoners that nobody saw coming. By the end of the North African campaign alone, over 275,000 Axis soldiers had been captured, and a huge chunk of them were German. Now here's where it gets interesting. The British were already drowning in prisoners. Their island was packed, resources were stretched thin, and they were literally running out of space. So they turned to America and basically said, "Hey, can you take some of these guys off our hands?" And America, despite being completely unprepared, said yes. This decision would lead to one of the most fascinating and little-known aspects of World War II. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States would house over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, with about 371,000 of them being German. That's more enemy soldiers than most people realize even set foot on American soil. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. The Army had to build an entire infrastructure from scratch. They established over 650 camps across the country, scattered through nearly every state. We're talking about camps in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, New York, even places like Montana and North Dakota. Some camps were massive compounds that held thousands of prisoners, while others were tiny work camps with maybe 50 or 100 guys. The government specifically chose locations in the interior of the country, far from the coasts where escape might be easier, and far from major industrial centers that could be sabotage targets. But here's what nobody expected. These camps weren't the brutal, dehumanizing hellholes that both sides had feared. Under the Geneva Convention, which the United States took surprisingly seriously, prisoners had to be treated humanely. They had to be given the same rations as American soldiers, the same quality of shelter, the same medical care. And let me tell you, for a lot of these German soldiers, especially the ones who'd been fighting in North Africa or on the Eastern Front, this was better than anything they'd experienced in their own army. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life looked like in these camps. Take Camp Concordia in Kansas, for example, which held about 4,000 German prisoners. The men would wake up in barracks that, while basic, were clean, heated in winter, and actually had real beds with mattresses. Breakfast might be oatmeal, eggs, bread, butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz garbage they'd been drinking in the Wehrmacht. After breakfast, prisoners who were enlisted men could be assigned to work details, which we'll get to in a minute. Officers, according to the Geneva Convention, couldn't be forced to work, so many of them spent their days reading, playing sports, or organizing educational classes. The food situation alone was revolutionary for these guys. Remember, Germany was under severe rationing by this point in the war. Many of these soldiers hadn't seen real meat in months, maybe years. But in American camps, they were getting the same rations as American troops, which meant beef, pork, chicken, fresh vegetables, milk, butter, and bread. Some prisoners later recalled that they ate better as POWs in America than they ever had as soldiers in the German army. There are documented cases of prisoners actually gaining weight during their captivity. Can you imagine? Prisoners of war getting healthier because the food was so much better than what they'd been eating while fighting. But the real story isn't just about the food or the barracks. It's about what happened when these hardened German soldiers, many of them true believers in Nazi ideology, came face to face with the reality of America. See, a lot of these guys had been fed propaganda about the United States for years. They'd been told that America was a weak, mongrel nation of mongrels, corrupted by Jews and capitalism, teetering on the edge of collapse. They expected poverty, racial violence, and chaos. What they found instead completely shattered their worldview. The work program was a huge part of this transformation. Because of the labor shortage caused by so many American men being overseas fighting, the United States desperately needed workers, especially in agriculture. So they put the POWs to work, under armed guard, of course, but they put them to work in fields, in canning factories, in lumber camps, and in all sorts of other industries. And here's the kicker. They paid them. Not much 80 cents a day in camp scrip that could be spent at the canteen, but they paid them. Prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other comfort items. For men who'd been told that Americans were barbaric capitalists who would work them to death, this was confusing, to say the least. The agricultural work especially created bizarre situations. You'd have German POWs working alongside American civilians in fields across the South and Midwest. They'd be picking cotton in Texas, harvesting sugar beets in Montana, cutting timber in Minnesota, and the American farmers and townspeople they encountered didn't treat them like monsters. They treated them like workers. Some farmers' wives would even bring out lemonade on hot days or invite prisoners to eat lunch on their porches. There are stories of farmers arguing with guards that the prisoners needed more breaks or better treatment. These American civilians who had sons and brothers fighting Germans overseas were showing kindness to enemy soldiers on their own soil. This created a cognitive dissonance that some prisoners simply couldn't reconcile. Here's a real example. At a camp in Arkansas, a group of prisoners was working on a farm when the farmer's wife brought out a huge lunch. Fried chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and apple pie for dessert. One young German soldier, who'd been in the Hitler Youth and was a dedicated Nazi, reportedly broke down crying. He couldn't understand why this American woman, whose country was at war with his, would feed him better than his own mother had been able to feed him back home in Germany for the past 2 years. The cultural exchange went both ways too. American guards and civilians were surprised to find that most German prisoners weren't the fanatical supermen that propaganda had made them out to be. They were just regular guys. Farmers' sons, factory workers, clerks, teachers. Many of them were conscripts who'd had no choice about joining the Wehrmacht. Sure, there were hardcore Nazis in the camps, and they created their own problems. But most prisoners were just trying to survive and get home eventually. Inside the camps, prisoners created entire miniature societies. They had orchestras, theater groups, art classes, and sports leagues. At Camp Como in Mississippi, prisoners built an elaborate miniature model of a German village, complete with a working water fountain. At other camps, they painted murals, created sculptures, and even published newspapers. The U.S. government actually encouraged these activities because it kept the prisoners occupied and reduced the chance of trouble. Some camps had libraries with thousands of books, both in German and English. Prisoners could take correspondence courses and work toward degrees. Many learned English, studied American history, and read American literature. Sports were huge. Germans loved soccer, obviously, and camps would have elaborate leagues with multiple teams competing in tournaments. But they also took to baseball, which many had never seen before. Guards would sometimes play against prisoner teams, and these games became major social events. There are photographs of these matches, and what's surreal is how normal everything looks. You see German soldiers in makeshift uniforms playing baseball with American guards watching and cheering, and except for the barbed wire in the background, you'd think it was just a regular summer afternoon at a ballpark. But let's not romanticize this too much. There were serious problems too. The biggest issue was internal conflict among the prisoners themselves. The hardcore Nazis, especially officers and U-boat crews who tended to be more ideologically committed, tried to maintain military discipline and Nazi ideology within the camps. They'd hold secret tribunals, intimidate other prisoners, and sometimes even commit violence against anyone they saw as a traitor. There were several murders in the camps, prisoners killed by other prisoners for being defeatists or for cooperating too much with the Americans. The most infamous case happened at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma in 1943. A German prisoner named Johannes Kunze, who had lived in America before the war and spoke English, was beaten to death by fellow prisoners who accused him of informing to the Americans. 5 prisoners were later tried, convicted, and hanged for the murder. This wasn't an isolated incident. The threat of violence from fanatical prisoners was real enough that camp commanders had to create separate compounds for anti-Nazi prisoners, men who denounced Hitler and wanted nothing to do with the Nazi faithful. This brings up one of the strangest aspects of the whole POW program: the American government's attempt at re-education. Starting in 1944, the War Department launched a program to try to de-Nazify the prisoners and turn them into democratic advocates who could help rebuild Germany after the war. They showed movies about American democracy, provided books critical of Nazism, and organized discussion groups. They even created a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, that was written by anti-Nazi prisoners but read by everyone in the camps. The results were mixed. Some prisoners genuinely changed their views, shocked by learning about the Holocaust and the true nature of the Nazi regime. Others just pretended to cooperate to get better treatment. And the hardcore believers? They dismissed it all as propaganda and doubled down on their Nazi faith. But the program did have an impact. By the time these men returned to Germany, many had been exposed to ideas and information they never would have encountered otherwise. Now let's talk about something that made this whole situation even more complicated: race in America. German prisoners were arriving in a country still deeply segregated, especially in the South where many camps were located. And here's where things got really uncomfortable. German POWs, because they were white, sometimes received better treatment than African American soldiers in the same areas. There are documented instances of German prisoners being allowed to eat in restaurants where Black American servicemen were turned away. They could sit in the front of buses while Black Americans had to sit in the back. They could watch movies in theaters that excluded Black patrons. This was absolutely insane, and it didn't go unnoticed. African American newspapers wrote scathing editorials about it. Black soldiers, who were fighting and dying for their country, watched as the enemy got treated better than they did on their own soil. Some German prisoners were actually shocked by this. They'd been told America was barbaric, but many hadn't expected to see this level of institutionalized racism. Some former prisoners later recalled being deeply disturbed by the treatment of Black Americans, which is ironic given the Nazi ideology of racial superiority they'd been fighting for. There were also romantic relationships that developed, which created its own controversies. Despite strict rules against fraternization, German prisoners working on farms or in towns would sometimes meet local women. In some cases, genuine relationships formed. There are documented cases of American women marrying German POWs after the war, waiting years for them to be repatriated to Germany and then following them there, or bringing them back to America once immigration restrictions were lifted. These relationships were scandalous at the time. How could an American woman fall for an enemy soldier while American boys were dying overseas? But human nature being what it is, it happened. In small towns where most young American men were gone to war, sometimes the only young men around were the German prisoners working on nearby farms. They'd see each other at church, at town events, or just in passing. Some of these relationships were superficial, but others were real. There's a story from Texas about a woman who fell in love with a German prisoner who worked on her father's farm. They had to keep it secret, but after the war ended and he was sent back to Germany, she actually followed him there, married him, and lived in Germany for the rest of her life. As the war turned decisively against Germany, conditions in the camps remained relatively stable. But the psychological state of the prisoners changed dramatically. By 1944, and especially 1945, it was clear Germany was losing. The D-Day invasion succeeded, the Red Army was pushing from the east, and Germany was being bombed around the clock. Prisoners in America were listening to news broadcasts and reading newspapers, watching their homeland being destroyed. Many hadn't heard from their families in years and had no idea if their loved ones were even alive. This created a strange dynamic. Many prisoners, especially those who'd been captured early in the war, were conflicted. On one hand, they were Germans and didn't want to see their country destroyed. On the other hand, some had come to realize that Nazi Germany was a criminal regime and its defeat was necessary. And practically speaking, they were safe and well-fed in America while their countrymen back home were suffering through the final brutal months of the war. Some prisoners felt guilty about this, survivor's guilt before anyone really had a term for it. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the prisoners' situation became even stranger. They were still prisoners, but the war was over. What now? The United States couldn't just release hundreds of thousands of Germans in America. That would cause chaos. And Germany was in ruins, occupied by Allied forces, barely functioning. So the prisoners stayed put. Many remained in American camps until 1946, and some weren't repatriated until 1947. They kept working, kept living their strange half-life as prisoners in a country that was no longer at war with them. During this extended period, the work program actually expanded. America needed help with reconstruction and agriculture, and the prisoners provided that labor. Some prisoners worked on projects like flood control on the Mississippi River or forest conservation in national parks. They built things that still exist today. In some camps, prisoners built chapels and other structures that are still standing, preserved as historical sites. The repatriation process, when it finally came, was bittersweet for many. Some prisoners were eager to go home, desperate to find their families and see if their homes still existed. Others were terrified. They'd been gone for years. Their country was destroyed and occupied, and they had no idea what they were going back to. Some prisoners who'd been in America for 3 or 4 years had actually built lives of a sort. They had friends, routines, skills they'd learned. Going back to a bombed-out Germany felt like being imprisoned all over again. There are incredible stories from the return journeys. Men who'd been captured in the deserts of North Africa, spent years in camps in Kansas or Arkansas, and then were shipped back to a Germany they barely recognized. Cities they'd known were gone, reduced to rubble. Family members were dead or missing. The economy was destroyed. Many former prisoners later said that the first months back in Germany were harder than their entire time as POWs in America. But here's where the story takes its final, most important turn. These men became ambassadors of a sort. They'd seen America firsthand. Not the propaganda version, but the real thing. They'd seen a functioning democracy, abundance, racial problems, yes, but also freedom and opportunity. Many became advocates for American-style democracy in post-war Germany. They'd learned trades and skills in American camps that they put to use rebuilding their country. Some maintained friendships with Americans they'd met, corresponding for decades after the war. There's a documented phenomenon where former POWs who'd been held in America had significantly more positive views of the United States and democracy than Germans who'd never left Europe. Some historians argue that these 371,000 men played a small but real role in Germany's post-war transformation. They'd seen that the enemy wasn't the monster they'd been told about. They'd experienced something different, and that experience changed them. In the decades after the war, something remarkable happened. Former prisoners started returning to America, not as captives, but as visitors. They'd bring their families to show them the camps where they'd been held, to visit the towns where they'd worked, to reconnect with people they'd known. Some camps even held reunions, bringing together former prisoners and former guards as old men, to reminisce about their strange shared experience. There are photographs of these reunions, elderly Germans and Americans embracing, laughing together about things that happened 40 or 50 years earlier. One particularly moving example comes from Oklahoma. A former prisoner named Georg Gärtner had actually escaped from his camp in 1945 and lived illegally in America for 40 years under an assumed name. He built a life, learned perfect English, and even got married. In 1985, at age 62, he finally turned himself in, expecting to be deported or imprisoned. Instead, the U.S. government basically shrugged and said the war had been over for 40 years and gave him legal residency. He spent his remaining years giving talks about his experience, and when he died, he was buried in America, the country that had once been his prison but had become his home. The legacy of the German POW camps in America is complicated. On one level, it's a story about how the United States, even while fighting a total war, mostly adhered to international law and treated prisoners humanely. That's genuinely admirable, especially when you contrast it with how prisoners were treated on other fronts of the war. But it's also a story that exposes America's own contradictions, particularly around race. And it raises uncomfortable questions about moral equivalency and who deserves decent treatment and when. But maybe the most profound aspect is how this experience changed individual lives. You had men who started as true believers in Nazism, who'd volunteered to fight for Hitler, who'd been taught that Americans were subhuman mongrels. And through the simple act of being treated decently, being fed, being allowed to be human, many of them changed their minds. Not all of them. Not even most of them, maybe, but enough that it mattered. They saw that the world was more complex than their ideology had taught them. Think about it. There's a direct line you can draw from a German soldier picking cotton in Texas in 1944 to the democratic, prosperous Germany we see today. It's not the only line, not even the main one, but it's there. These men went back and told their stories. They raised children in post-war Germany with a different perspective than they would have had otherwise. Some became teachers, businessmen, politicians, passing along what they'd learned about democracy and human decency. There are still a few survivors alive today, men in their late 90s or beyond, the last living links to this strange chapter of history. When interviewed, many of them say the same thing. Their time as prisoners of war in America was one of the most important experiences of their lives. It's strange to hear someone say that being a prisoner was formative in a positive way, but that's what makes this story so compelling. It wasn't supposed to work out like this. War isn't supposed to lead to understanding and transformation, but sometimes, under the right circumstances, it can. The physical traces of this history are fading now. Most of the camps were dismantled after the war, the barracks torn down, the land repurposed. A few sites remain, preserved as historical landmarks or museums. You can visit some of them and walk through reconstructed barracks, see the artwork prisoners created, read their letters and diaries. These sites tell a story that most Americans know nothing about, of a time when hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers lived in our midst and somehow, improbably, it worked out. So what do we take from this? Maybe it's that even in the midst of the worst war humanity had ever seen, there were moments of basic human decency that cut across enemy lines. Maybe it's that treating people humanely, even your enemies, isn't just morally right, but practically smart because it can change hearts and minds. Maybe it's just a reminder that history is always more complicated than we think, full of ironies and contradictions and unexpected outcomes. Whatever the lesson, the story of German POWs in America during World War II remains one of the most fascinating, surprising, and ultimately hopeful chapters of that terrible conflict. It's a reminder that even in our darkest hours, we're capable of being better than we have to be, and that kindness, even to our enemies, can echo through generations.